Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my deep dive series. I've started from the back of the pack, and I'm working my way to the front of the pack, and so this week I'll be diving into Red Bull and comparing them to the teams that ended the championship around them, and diving into those drivers for the Red Bull team, and kind of comparing them in the Drivers' Championship where they finished in that Drivers' Championship, so the drivers are around them. Now, we kind of had some issues with Red Bull this year. They did actually maintain that third position overall from last year. And it was kind of a disappointment in many people's minds because Max had 8 wins total and was only 2 points away from Lando for that Drivers' Championship. So it's kind of disappointing that they only maintained third and that we're not able to at least get up to that second position in the constructors' standings. Now, why was that? Basically, we had that early start off switch off with Lawson only having 2 races before switching over to Yuki Tsunoda, which kind of threw things off from the very beginning. The car had a very narrow window for operating, and the balance issues that were had in that basically Max was struggling with at the beginning, but was able to still take the full advantage of that, where that second driver was not able to really get the grips on that narrow window and get it dialed in correctly. They did have a mid-year, upgrade to the floor, and Max was able to get the most out of that, where Yuki at that point in time still couldn't get the most average of that to pull out what he needed to out of that Red Bull to get up into those points on a more regular basis. Now, Yuki did underperform compared to Max with only 230 laps in the top 8 positions and only scoring a few points when he actually did score. So Yuki was, even though he was a decent driver, I think overall, he really couldn't get his grips around that really fine-tuned Red Bull that was right on the edge and couldn't quite be able to get there and comparatively to Max in that regard. We also had Christian Horner getting fired in July, which threw some instability in the team management and direction for that team. So that kind of threw some things, hopefully for the better, in the sense that, that team can gel and kind of work towards a different kind of setup, which will help more than just Max in that running. But due to Max's skill and mostly consistent drives, only had a couple of drive or races that were kind of off, he was able to, basically pull that Red Bull team up and maintain that third position, with the Ferrari kind of struggling at this year as well when they were expected to be, fighting for that, Constructors' Championship as well. So due to those two circumstances, they were able to maintain that, third position overall and get up there and kind of fight a little bit with Mercedes, but still kind of, in that third position. Now, if you want to dive into a little bit of the 2 drivers, we can see that Max out qualified in the sprint sessions, Yuki 4 out of the 5 times. And in those finishing those sprint races, he outperformed Yuki 4 out of those 5 sprint races as well. So he kind of dominated those sprint races. And if you wanted to go into those GP races, you can see that Max out-qualified Yuki 21 out of the 22 times that they had those GP races. So only once did Yuki able to pull out ahead of Max in those qualifying. And the same result was for the full race. Yuki was, not quite making it to that point. And so Max was able to outperform Yuki at the end of those GP races 21 out of those 22 times. And it's kind of as already said that Yuki only outperformed Max 1 out of the 5 times in the sprint race. And the same thing for the sprint qualifying, was just 1 out of those 5 times that Yuki was able to, get ahead of Max in that running. And for the GP races, it's the same thing. Only 1 out of the 22 times that they were together on those GP races in the Red Bull was Yuki able to get ahead of Max in those qualifying sessions. And the same thing for the finishing positions. And that's probably due to a DNF. And here we can see a nice little chart, describing how that Red Bull team played out through this season and kind of the averages that they had. So they were in third last year in 2024, and they were third in 2025 as well. Their average start position for the sprint qualifying was 9.5, and they moved that up slightly to those sprint finishing positions of an average of a 9.2. Now for the GP, qualifying positions, they averaged a 12th and moved up to a 9.9 for those GP finishing positions. And they only had 3 DNFs total, and those were all in the GP races. Now, if you're going to break that down to the drivers, and I threw Liam Lawson in this mix as well, just to give you an idea, since you're kind of comparing him slightly to Yuki in those couple of races. Now, he didn't get the full run for the season or even half the season, so it's kind of hard to compare those, but I figured I'd throw him in there just to give you a little bit of extra information. So, of course, you have Max, standing in first position last year in the Drivers' Championship and dropped down to second this year. He averaged a 3.5 sprint qualifying position and averaged a finish sprint race in 5th. He averaged a 3.6, GP qualifying for the, that's the where all the big points kind of start off with on those GP races. And so starting off in that 3.5 to 4 position is not bad with that, struggling Red Bull this year. It was basically the same thing for the finishing position, just slightly back in that 3.7 marker for those GP races throughout the year. And he did have 1 DNF in those GP races over the course of the season. So you compare him mainly to Yuki here, who started off in 12th in 2024, and it was 17th this year in 2025. He averaged a 14.8 starting position for the sprint qualifying and moved up to that 8.6 for the sprint races finishing positions. So he could move up quite a bit, but he still wasn't able to really take advantage and really get in those points on a truly basis. He was right on the edge of getting points every race on average. So he got into points fairly frequently on the sprint races, but at the very end of those points, again, only 1 or 2 points, and wasn't there every race either. So that was kind of hurting him in that regard. Now for the GP races, he started off in 13.3, so slightly ahead of the sprint qualifying, and he moved up to 12.5 in those GP finishes. So he didn't quite get the momentum he needed in those GP races and staying outside the points on average. Again, not where he needed to be in that Red Bull. And again, he only had 1 of those DNFs for the Racing Bulls, and that was in a GP race. And then we just want to throw some Liam Lawson in the mix just for your information. I didn't kind of put his standings there because it's not really relevant to the Red Bull side of it, but I figured I'd average his couple of race starts for sprint qualifying was 19, and he finished in 14. And the same thing for his GP races. He started off in that 19th spot for the GP races. I was able to move up to that 13.5 marker for the finishing those couple of GP races that he was able to run in before they switched him over to the Racing Bulls. And he also had a DNF as well. So that kind of hurt him overall in those numbers, being knocked out quite early on in that setup. But it kind of gives you a rough idea how you're going to compare those drivers, even though he didn't get a tremendous amount of data on Liam Lawson. And here we're comparing those 3 Red Bull drivers. So you have Liam Lawson in that sprint race, that one that he did in China, and then that's why he just has a dot. I figured I'd just give him there for completion's sake. And then, of course, you see Max Verstappen in red and Yuki Tsunoda in yellow in these runnings. And, of course, the trend line going down is better because it means that you're finishing those sprint races in a higher end position, closer to that, true first position that you want to be in. So you can kind of see here he had a kind of an off in Miami, but otherwise he was doing fairly well in those sprint races, pretty consistent, pretty even across the board, getting better throughout the season because of that Miami race. But of course, if you look at that and compare him to the trend line for Yuki, he's ahead of Yuki throughout the whole season. Yuki was getting slightly worse throughout the season, not quite on par in that regard, kind of having that bad moment in Brazil, which kind of hurt him in those sprint races as well. But that kind of gives you kind of a lay of the land for those 3 Red Bull drivers. And here we're going to compare Max Verstappen around those drivers that finished up in that front running position. So we can get Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris in those top drivers' championship positions. So that's where we're going to compare Max Verstappen to. And so you can kind of look here in those runnings. And so We had the kind of opposite running here in Miami, where Max had a bad off in that sprint, where Oscar and Lando did fairly well, but near the end of the season, like in Austin, Lando had a problems in that sprint race, as well as Oscar, but Oscar carried that to that next sprint race as well in Brazil, having an issue there, not getting where he needed to be, but coming back in cutter. So we kind of compare those drivers in those situations and kind of figure out how those are going to play out. Now you can kind of get an idea of that through the trend lines as we're kind of looking at those. So whereas Oscar was kind of getting worse throughout this year because of those two bad sprint races, and Lando's was getting slightly better, but not quite where he needed to be, with Max Verstappen getting better because of that one issue at the beginning of the season in Miami, where he came back later and was really consistent in those next 4 sprint races. And you can kind of give an idea of where those were on that board and kind of figure out how well they were doing in this season. So here we're going to look at Yuki and compare him against Pierre Gasly and Lance Stroll in those same 6 sprint races, and we kind of look at that in that Red Bull sense. So because of that, Yuki still doesn't have the one in China because he switched over to Red Bull after that fact. But here you kind of get an idea of how they were comparing to those drivers around them, and they were kind of consistently, going up and down to roughly the same spot, but Yuki was pretty far ahead of them in regards to the trend lines, as he was right around that 9th, 8th place, whereas, Pierre Gasly started off back and ended up farther back. And Lance Stroll, even though he started up ahead of Yuki in that trend line position, ended up farther back quite a bit in that trend line, saying he's getting quite worse throughout the season as they weren't able to really develop that Aston Martin and get the most out of that throughout the whole season in that regard. And here we're just comparing those same 3 Red Bull drivers in those GP races. So we had Liam Lawson in those first 2 races, where then Yuki Tsunoda picked up from that point forward. And you can see right off the bat that, Max Verstappen was way ahead of his teammate overall in that regard. He's pretty steadily ahead of him on almost all fronts, getting better throughout this season and starting off in that roughly that 5th position on that trend line and getting down to that, maybe 2nd position, possibly 3rd at the end of that trend line. But he had that, kind of off first part of the season where he came back, from that, Netherlands on forward, pretty consistently getting up there, getting really consistent drives in that running, where Yuki was kind of sporadic across the board, even though he was getting slightly better throughout the season, but quite a bit farther back behind his teammate, Max Verstappen. And of course, I threw Liam Lawson in there for those first 2 runs, where he was in that 15th, 11th positions in regard to those couple of races that he was in, and kind of comparing him to how Yuki was picking that 2nd seat up in regards to that. Now, of course, you're not a whole lot of data, so you can't really speculate too much, but I figured I'd throw that in just to, as again, for that completionist side of things. Now we're going to compare Max Verstappen against Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri in those GP races to kind of give a better fine-tunement for those top positions. And here you can kind of see how well they were doing against each other in those regards. Whereas Max Verstappen was getting better throughout the season, Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri were getting slightly worse, even though they had a pretty good car and consistently and kept them, at that edge. Max really came on strong at that second, half of the season, really blasting forward, getting a lot of his points at that point in time, almost coming back to win the Drivers' Championship. And so you can kind of see that how that played out here, especially with some of those offs that, the McLaren drivers had in roughly that second half, even though there was a couple of in that front part. That really second half kind of hurt them on those few races that they just were really, knocked out on in regards to being a really consistent drive in those GP races. And here we're comparing Yuki Tsunoda against Pierre Gasly and, Lance Stroll again in those GP races, and can you kind of figure out where they are? And they kind of bunched up, of course, around that 14th-ish, maybe 13th place markers across the season, and kind of far behind where we would think that they should be in regards to that Red Bull team. But you can kind of compare how they were played out. And of course, Yuki was getting better throughout the season, but not quite where he needed to be compared to his teammate. whereas Pierre Gasly and Lance Stroll were getting worse throughout the season, slightly overall the course of that, dropping back into those back markers more and more. But you can kind of get a look and figure out how well they were doing, race to race, and get the ebbs and flows a little bit of how those teams were doing from race to race, and potentially edging out, trying to get them up a little higher in those point standings. And here we're looking at the points scored race by race for the two Red Bull drivers. And I left off Liam Lawson in that regard, just because those are the main point markers here. And Liam Lawson didn't get any points in the first two races anyway. So we were kind of looking at that in that front side of things, where you can see Yuki was getting very few points here and there across the season, where Max was the dominant point hauler from the very beginning to the very end, with those trend lines going up for Max Verstappen pretty decently, where he came back strong after that update for that Red Bull, and was really consistently getting up into those top five and potentially getting closer to those, winning those races as well. So in that regard, he was really strong in that front point, whereas Yuki was, pretty steady, getting slightly better as, again, those points throughout the season, but still way back behind his teammate. And this is that same information just in a step graph, and so you can see the big difference in the gaps between him and his teammate from Max and Yuki on those point scoring options and throughout the season, and where Yuki wasn't really putting any kind of pressure on his teammate throughout this year. And of course that was kind of hurting the Red Bull as well as Yuki, as he wasn't able to get at the grips. And again, I don't think necessarily Yuki is a bad driver comparatively. He just wasn't able to get the grips around how that Red Bull was set up and configured, on that knife's edge to get the most out of that Red Bull. And I'm not sure if that's the case for all of that, but I mean, it does put a big portion of that in that realm. And we'll have to see, this coming 2026 year, and see with the new regulations, and see if those, are closer together on those first and second cars for Red Bull, or if there's another big gap and how they're doing things at Red Bull. And now we're diving into the teams and the points on those teams for those 6 sprint races, and where they get the points for Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes. And you can kind of look at this graph and kind of get an idea how each of those teams was working throughout the season in those sprint races. As we can see that Ferrari was having a worse time at the end of the season than they were at the beginning of the season, where Red Bull was kind of slowly getting at the beginning, but kind of came back strong at the end. And of course, Mercedes was pretty constant across the board, but slightly getting better as well throughout the season on those sprint races. And so you kind of get that edge of that gaining the points that he needed to into that second position for Mercedes, and keeping Red Bull into that third. And this is that same information for those sprint races, just in a step graph format, so you can kind of get the ebbs and flows. If it was just the sprint races that we're getting points on, how those teams would lay out throughout the season, where you can kind of see them, Mercedes start off in that second position, and Red Bull was in that last position, but was able to overtake Mercedes, mid-season, but fell back again behind them at the end of the season, but overtook Ferrari at the end as well. So kind of leveling that out and keeping that second position overall. And here we're getting to the heart of the points for those GP races, and so you can kind of see where all those major points were scored for each of those teams for each race, and kind of figure out the trend lines for the major portion of the season, and how those points were allocated for these teams. And so you can see here, the blue for Red Bull here was pretty consistent and getting better throughout the season because of Max at the end getting those really core drives that he wasn't won halfway through the season after that update, where he could early take advantage of that Red Bull, where Ferrari was getting worse throughout the season, where they weren't able to get the grips on that development of that car and get those updates they needed to have both drivers getting good points. And of course, Mercedes coming in there with a rookie and a veteran, being more consistent across the board, slightly getting better, but still doing good. Of course, these trend lines here are the points, so you want to have a upward swing on those trend lines, saying that you're getting better as you're getting more points throughout this season. And here's that same data for those GP races, if you're just counting those and not the sprint races, and how those teams ebbed and flow on those GP races. So you kind of get an idea how Mercedes was comparing to Red Bull in this scenario, and where Ferrari was lacking a little bit in that second, half of the season, kind of dropping back behind those two teams where they were kind of fighting a little bit more at that midsection of the season. And so they kind of played out in that regard. And you kind of look at that and kind of figure out how those ebbs and flows played out. And of course, you have to add the sprint races points in there to get an official picture. And for that official picture, this is kind of the look from race for race. So this includes the sprint races as well as the GP races. And so this is where you have to find your magnifying glass and play, spot the differences. So you switch back and forth between this graph and the GP graph and try to figure out how well that affect the teams throughout the season, adding those sprint races in the mix. And it's really seeing how significant those sprint races are, if at all, for these teams. And again, so you're pretty consistent here. You can see, Red Bull getting more points throughout the season. So they have an upward trend on that trend line, whereas Mercedes was pretty constant, having a slightly upward trend line, and Ferrari getting worse throughout the season, so having a slightly downgrade on that trend line. And you can just kind of look at those. And of course, this is, again, the combined points for the sprint races and GP races. And this is that same information just in a step graph format. So this is the full picture of how those three teams were playing out throughout the season. And so you have to kind of go back and forth again to try to spot the differences and to see if those sprint races were really that advantageous or not comparatively across the season. And the main thing that I kind of pick up here is in that basically that Mexico race where Ferrari and Mercedes kind of came together, in that because of those sprint races, getting that potential to be ahead of Mercedes at that point, but then of course then fell back quite significantly through those next few races. But in general, you can kind of look at that and try to figure out where those teams lined up and kind of get an idea how well those sprint races affect the season overall. And so what's coming up next week, of course, we have a deep dive into Mercedes. And if you made it this far in my deep dive series, I really appreciate it. And we only have a couple of teams left with Mercedes and McLaren coming up in the next couple of weeks. So if you want to get notified about those, I'd appreciate a subscribe. And if you enjoyed this kind of information, I would appreciate a like as well. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.